So for the next session, we will have a panel, and we will be talking about government and what is the role of government and the role of regulation and policy. One thing that I forgot to mention earlier, if you have any questions, please save them till the end. So all of the presenters and the panelists will be here to answer questions at the end. So please save your questions, and I'll welcome the panelists up now.
What's not obvious to everybody down there is behind us there's a big drop, so we're all really careful about these chairs. So thank you very much, everybody, and welcome to the first panel here. Now, back in August, we had the publication of the NIST standards after what was probably a decade's work by pretty much everybody who was everybody in cryptography. So now we're going to be looking at what the next steps are. What's the role for our governments, for the various national cybersecurity groups, basically to help guide this transition. And you've already heard from Gary what's happening with CISA in the USA, and a lot of countries are looking at the US as a potential leader in that space and someone that you can shamelessly copy the good work. And of course, we've also got to figure out how we update all of our mobile infrastructure. So that's our topic. Let's start off with my panelists, and let's perhaps ask each of you, give us a brief introduction to yourself, what organization you represent, and perhaps one fun fact about how you got involved in post-quantum cryptography. Daphne.
Okay, hello, I'm Daphne Nisbeth. I am with NSA's Center for Cybersecurity Standards. NSA got involved in post-quantum cryptography because we have equities that need protection for a long time. We deal primarily, our jurisdiction is national security systems and a defense industrial base. You'll hear me say NSS and DIB quite often here. And there's data and information that needs to be protected for a very long time. And as the world started to get more involved in researching quantum technologies and the excitement around a quantum computer, we knew this is something that we actually really needed to pay attention to. We needed to be looking at how we can maintain the security of our systems as the world is moving towards quantum computing. It's not really fun, but
okay.
That's our reason.
Lamont, how do you...
Yeah, so hi, I'm Lamont Copeland. I'm the Senior Director for Verizon. I'm running our solution architecture team. So basically what we do on a day-to-day basis is provide all the systems and solutions and technology which support all the enterprise work for our government today, moving data from point A to point B and helping to deliver on outcomes for whether it's a mission base or something for providing support to citizens, whatever the needs of the government are. I've got involved with security and quantum security quite a few years ago. It was really, I started coming out of college doing designs of networks and things of that nature, and then moved and started working into designing security systems and trying to understand how to protect that data, protect what's happening with our nation's infrastructure. And then the quantum computing stuff started getting more and more traction, and it made me get excited about, okay, there's an impact of what this does to what I'm building today on a day-to-day basis. So what could we do? What could we look at and see how we get involved with improving the infrastructure, improving the security posture of that, and getting prepared for the Q day whenever that happens, whenever there is that quantum computer and we're ready to protect all the data that we have. So that's a little bit about me and how I got involved with it.
Cool. Michaela.
Thank you. My name is Michaela Juhat. I'm with Microsoft. I'm actually in government and government affairs. And I joined Microsoft in government affairs from a technical background in 5G because Microsoft wanted to understand more on what telecommunication means from our company's perspective, but also to understand the regulation and the sort of the legislative environment nationally, but also internationally from a telecom perspective, and 5G among the technologies being looked at. Now, that was about 4 years ago. About 3 years ago, I started to move into quantum, actually, which sort of made my world, change quite a bit, because I'm an engineer by profession, but I have to say I read many books, and I've heard somebody talking about that earlier. I think I understand, and the next thing happens, I realize I don't understand. So it's, it's constant, it's 3 years, but that's how I got into quantum. And the good thing is that I go a lot on the hill, and when I talk about quantum, the tendency is to turn back to me. But then the first question that they ask, actually, it's about PQC. So this is very interesting, because that's what it's not all the goodness that a quantum computer can do, but the security implications of actually having a quantum computer that it's able to do the Shor's algorithm. So that's how I got involved in PQC.
Okay, thank you. And I shall give a shameless plug to the GSMA task force here. So one of the things that we did publish last Friday was actually a summary around the world of what the different initiatives and recommendations around post-quantum cryptography from 16 governments plus the G7. So you might find that a useful reference, and we'll try and keep that up to date. So let's go on to the sort of next question. We've got a transition underway to post-quantum cryptography, and so I'd like to, perhaps I'll start with Lamont. Why do you believe this transition's important for telecoms, and how long do we actually have? Why is now the time when we actually have to take action?
Yeah, so we have to take action now, because it's one of those things where you're not going to just turn on and put all these encryptions into the systems and ready to have them go and be ready to, everything be protected. There's activities that's happening today. We want to be able to make sure that we're built and ready to take care of whenever that quantum computer is available to break this encryption, but also to start protecting the data that we have today because of the whole, store now, decrypt later activity. So all these things have to take place, but most importantly is, again, it doesn't happen overnight. There are things that have to look at when you're talking about the inventory of these, the encryption mechanisms, but it also the interrelations of that to the systems and the solutions and all the capabilities that are built into an environment. You got to look at, okay, is everything, what are all the different pieces that have encryption associated with them? What devices are they inside of? How those devices all interact and work together? And then how do you work between the things where you have to go through with backwards compatibility? How does it work with performance testing? How does it work with making sure that we have communication that doesn't stop? Because you have to protect all aspects of that network. And to do that, it's going to take a lot of testing and time and understanding of how these things should be built into a migration plan, built into our environment. And without doing it now, you can't then wait for that incident to happen and then try to really quickly retroactively build this into place. So you have to do this now. When this could happen, who knows? I mean, we all are at the race of trying to get this quantum computer out there today. Will it happen while we're sitting on this stage? Who knows? I mean, doubt it will, but who knows? But the key aspect is there are so many interoperability pieces that we have to look at to make sure that we're ready. And it's not just the encryption mechanisms. We also have to look at the digital signatures. So don't forget, these are two parts of this, is the encryption of the data itself, but it's also the digital signature of how I am as a user doing my transactions, as you'll hear, and saying I am Lamont, that's going to be able to get money out of a bank or transfer information. So how does all that stuff work and tie together? So, to end it all in short is, now is the time so that we can make sure that all these systems work. They have that interoperability with one another, backwards compatibility, and we have the flexibility as well to be able to build these into our systems and continue like nothing happened on a day-to-day basis for the typical user that doesn't think about quantum on the days.
Thank you. I mean, Michaela, obviously Microsoft has huge amounts of infrastructure, and you are actually testing out some of these algorithms. So again, from your perspective, the timing and why now? Why do we want to focus on this now? Why can't we just wait a decade?
So, generally speaking, we don't want to start from a position of fear, but national security has been, something that everybody's talking about, and it's very important to understand what China is doing versus the rest of the world from a quantum perspective. In fact, there is a report that was published a couple of weeks ago by ITIF, which is a think tank that talks about China investing 14 billion, which is more than all the Western countries together in quantum. And the same report talks about quantum networking being the highest investment in what they are doing from this 14 billion. Now, having said that, that's a piece that is very important to keep in mind, because if they get to Q-Day, as you mentioned, which can be 5 years from now, worst case scenario, or best case scenario, depending on who comes with the quantum computer, data has been already harvested. You don't want data that it's now a secret to be continuous. That data you want US, or you want a country that actually has some principles that are aligned to make sure that has the data and not available to be decrypted by somebody else. So national security, very important. The second thing is, everybody, I hope it's aware about RIP and replace, what happened with the whole program. It's going to be a long program. It's going to be very costly. So while Verizon has the resources and we have the resources to do a lot, we have to think about the weakest links or the carriers that actually don't have the budgets to go through the migration process, nor the knowledge, in fact. And then the third point that I would like to make is that it will take the industry and government working together to go through this migration, because you'll have to share tools, you'll have to share best practices, you'll have to learn from each other and make sure that we move together into migrating to PQC.
Thank you. And I suppose, Daphne, from your perspective, your agency's already published some of your thoughts around what the timelines are. How would you emphasize the importance of people starting now rather than waiting?
So NSA, of course, published CNSA 2.0. So we've let the world know these are the algorithms that we plan to use. We've published a timeline. We plan to have this migration done by 2035. But then you'll also notice in that timeline that there's steps along the way. It's not just 2035, we now decide we're going to start doing this. We have to actually take some steps. There's some systems and some sections of systems that are going to be migrated by 2030. Some are going to be migrated by 2033, some even before that. You heard Gary speak for CISA that they're having a timeline of 2030. Transitions take time. If you looked at the slide that Gary actually put up there, I thought that was a perfect slide for transitions taking time. There are all these steps along the way that go along with making a transition. And underneath all of this are standards that have to be developed. So NIST has put out these standards. These algorithms now need to be incorporated into security protocols. So IETF is working on that. And then those protocols now being updated need to be incorporated into telecom systems. 3GPP and ORAN Alliance would have to work on that. And all of this takes time. If I told my kids I'm planning now for an event in 2035, they were like, oh, that's forever away. But those in standards know that that is a very, very tight timeline. And these transitions take time. There are so many steps along the way. And because of all these steps, because of all the work that has to go into this, it's critically important that we start now.
Indeed. So thank you for that. Actually, I'll ask you another thought. So we've already got the three FIPS standards have come out. We've got key encapsulation. We've got the first attempts at digital signatures. And I mentioned the GSMA summary of all of the guidance we're seeing. And we're seeing, around the world, you've seen the CISA thing, we're getting, in some countries at least, additional guidance on what firms, what organizations should be doing around that transition. So I think a question is, what's the right type of guidance? Is it at the algorithm level? Is it the key length level? Is it at the systems level? What's the right sort of guidance to be giving industry to help them plan?
So for the U.S. government, we have a multi-pronged approach. For national security systems, defense industrial base, we're pretty much going to say, we want these algorithms at this particular security level, period. Okay. This is what we will be using. Then you also will have CISA who will come and give guidance on how the federal agencies are able to do this transition. You'll have NIST that will also be putting out guidance on how industry and others are able to also move in this direction. So on my side, coming representing NSA, we're basically saying this is what we will use. End of story. And anyone who wants to play with us in our national security systems, this is what we're expecting to see there. Then you'll have that next step, which is saying, hey, here's how you start to transition and what you need to look at when you're doing the transition. Then and that's for federal agencies. Then you'll have a, hey, let's get everyone in the room talking. And so you'll notice a lot when you're looking at PQC guidance from the U.S. government, you're seeing NSS, we're talking specifically NSA there, you're going to see FCEB, those federal agencies under CISA, and then you also see NIST, National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, that's also going to be giving you more of an opportunity for industry to also get in the room and have these discussions. So the U.S. government's guidance is going to take a multi-pronged approach because there are very different equities depending on what types of systems you're using and how you interact with our government.
Okay, so if I turn to you, so you're one of the consumers of these guidance in that you provide networks to the federal government on all sides and to enterprise customers. So from your perspective, what guidance do you need and how might you pass those on to your customers? Because they will look to you, because frankly, you have a much better understanding of network security than many of the firms that will consume your services.
Yeah, so I mean, we're always proud to partner and make sure that we're providing the security systems for our national government and for all these national security systems. And the key part is taking those lessons learned and understanding how to then proliferate those across those multi-pronged approaches like you're saying, because what is necessary when we build things out, we're looking at, okay, what is the hardest level of things that we want to make sure that we're working towards and building on? And that's usually our defense systems and making sure that those are hardened and making sure that there's no leakage of any data. Taking those same lessons learned is then how do you then pull that up to those different layers of consumers that are coming onto there, whether it's going to be to a civilian agency, to the DIB, or even down to our consumer base too as well, because this is not just a governmental-wide problem. This is a problem for all of our nation to be able to protect the data. So the big part about it is how do we take what we're building out for guidance, what we're building out for all the what's necessary for our most stringent systems, taking what we can pull together and then bringing that and proliferating that across the network, across all of our vendor ecosystem too as well, because it's not just how do I put the security into the network, but it's then all those components that are latching onto that network or providing those additional services when it gets down to the radios that are going off for the wireless network, or down to the devices that are connecting and attaching to the network itself, even down to the application. So all these things have to be taken into consideration when we're talking about building that ecosystem out. So taking those, looking at that multi-pronged approach, as you're saying, and making sure that you apply the right level to each one of those layers based off the needs of the customers.
And I suppose Microsoft has a huge presence in enterprise computing, but also in providing services to consumers, to people at home. So from your perspective, again, how do you take that guidance and then what do you provide on to your end customers to help them make this transition?
So first of all, we thank for all the guidance that we can get, and we need very clear guidance and very clear requirements, and something that it's very helpful for all industry to get. So very thankful for that. Now, obviously, we have a huge ecosystem as well as developers, so we have to, on our side, to provide guidance to the ecosystem and developers as well on what they need to do. So there is a whole process that we are going through, from establishing goals to establishing accountability to creating the tools, to sharing the tools, to creating solutions that range from actually the automated inventory that gets done in a certain company up to remediation, right? So it's a full suite of steps that you have to take to understand, first of all, what's being used in an enterprise and what needs to be changed and when does it need to be changed. Now, obviously, we have segments that are more or less interested. So you have segments like the financial industry that it's much more aggressive in implementing PQC. They are looking at QKD as well, something that the industry, it's not very clear whether it's the right thing to do, but they are trying. So they are much more aggressive because their data, obviously, it's very important. And then you have a mom and pop shop that may not be so, that may not be so important. So we have this range of getting the requirements, understanding them, making sure that we implement them, because that's the first step that obviously we have to do, and then share those with our customers.
Okay. Now you mentioned financial services, and we've seen actually last week the demonstrations at the G7 looking at how we can make transactions quantum safe there. But there are lots of differences between different sectors and different industries. We see here in this room what the telecoms industry is doing. We can see what's happening in financial services with the World Economic Forum, the G7. But what do we need to do on a sector-by-sector basis to help make individual industries, individual sectors safe? And what can we do, either in government or as the leaders in this space, to help build that industry transition to PQC? And again, I think, Michaela, given your ecosystem, you're perhaps best placed to start answering that.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I would say you have to treat different verticals differently. Okay. I would say that you have to look at critical infrastructure, sort of what Gary was talking about, right? Critical infrastructure versus non-critical infrastructure. So as cloud is a critical infrastructure, so will be, the security, PQC, quantum will be perhaps deemed as critical infrastructure, AI now. And the thing is, what happens is all these technologies are coming together, and actually it's mind-boggling sometimes on how fast discovery is happening. And if we are not prepared for the critical systems to be secured first, we are not doing our job. So I think it's more on criticality versus vertical, looking at vertical systems.
That's an interesting perspective. Now, you have to provide network infrastructure to both critical companies and to the majority of the US economy. Again, how do you see that same way that Michaela does, or do you see that there is a role for things to be done that's industry or sector specific?
Yeah, I see there's going to be a cross-function of both of those, but you're going to have to look at that. I mean, you're going to have to look at, the criticality of data and how do you protect that in specific ways, but then also how do the use cases work inside of each one of these verticals too? Because there's similarities and there's differences that we need to be able to look at when we're trying to build out the systems, build out the migration protocols and the mechanisms. There's also to look at how these things look in real time versus non-real time, because some data I can work on and these encryptions can, possibly have a performance impact. We don't know without doing all the testing that's necessary to build that out. And how does that then impact something where I have, like, if you take public safety, I need to have data real time, on time, and I want it to be protected at the same time. So I have to make sure that I'm protecting that data, but I'm also making sure it's getting there at the time needed for each one of those first responders to do what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. Compared to then if I'm doing something with research or in the field with like a Department of Interior or Department of Labor, I'm trying to get like labor data out about the jobs report, it's still very critical, important data that we want to protect, but it's not as real time. So it's trying to make sure we understand the risk and the criticality and association with all that data so we can then put the right mechanism in place for that. But then when you're looking at that also, it's still protection of data. So the question is then, how do we start doing information sharing across each one of our verticals and across all the criticality and non-critical data? Because then that's when we're starting to build up the ecosystem, build up the knowledge base of what is necessary to build in the protections that are needed for today. So it's understanding and putting that risk factor against each one of those data pieces, but then also how do we then take that information and build that community of interest to say, here's what we experienced when we did this migration or when we were trying to protect this data. Here's what you experienced, so then we can then try to do a better practice for delivering out these systems accordingly.
And Daphne, when you look at this from the perspective of the government actually trying to secure all of the different sectors, because you're responsible for all of them at the end of the day, again, do you see that the guidance that you will give will be generic, will be horizontal, or will you see, is there a role for things that are specific to an individual sector? Because I've been wrestling with that question as we build the task force.
So for this one, I want to just put on my NSA hat and say that's not our
Okay.
our jurisdiction. However, I do think that I agree. I agree with what Lamont is saying. I also agree with what Michaela is saying, that you kind of have to look at different situations. There's going to be some guidance that's going to be very generic. It's going to go across the entire board, and everyone's going to have to kind of have a good look at how they can implement that. And then there are going to be sections that do have to be specific and tied to a specific sector. You can even see that in the National Security Memorandum 10, NSM 10. There are sections that are clearly laid out as this is something that is very specific to NSS, and there's sections that are clearly laid out for FCEB agencies. Even there's the general guidance for all of the federal government and what we're going to do. And then there's specific guidance based on the type of systems, the type of data that you're going to be using. Even what Gary was mentioning about hybrid, there are going to be some agencies, ours is one of them, that is going to pretty much say, we don't really want to deal with hybrid in this way. And then there are others that because of their use cases, it's going to matter. And they're going to have to look at those different things. So it's a combination of both.
I suppose I shouldn't be surprised at those answers. But it does mean that we're all going to have to take on board, that we're going to have to develop, both common and then some specific guidance. Okay. So one of the things that I think that's been mentioned by Gary is the OMB study of what the implications of this were for the US government and an assessment of what the investment required, I think $7 billion over the next 10 years. And so I'd like to look at that from two perspectives. And I'm going to ask Daphne firstly. What lessons have we learned, have you learned, that you can share from the process of actually doing the first phase of that cryptographic discovery? And how much of that actually is the technical work of doing cryptographic discovery versus actually engaging all the stakeholders and getting their support for the work that you need to do?
So this is another one. I'm coming from NSA, so I'm going to heavily caveat everything.
Yeah.
This is just what we do. So once again, jurisdiction here being NSS and DIB. But the question actually applies more broadly across the government. And I think there are other guidances that have been put out recently that give some very good lessons and some very good key points to keep in mind when doing these inventories. Guidance such as the document from CISA that's talking about their automatic crypt discovery tools. Guidance such as the report put out, like the PQC report that was put out from the White House, kind of showing where we are in the process. NIST NCCOE PQC migration project has a lot of really good guidance that actually gives a very good place for industry to participate in the process of creating the guidance that industry then can use. But the three key points I think that come out of those, first would be that this is an ongoing process. This isn't one and done. In an earlier session, they were talking about continuous testing. Well, this is continuous inventorying, right? You're going to start this process, you're going to start your inventory, you're going to have to update it because Software is updated, firmware is updated, crypt is updated, device is updated. You're going to have patches. You're going to have so much updating and even replacement of products. You have to be in the mindset that this is a continuous process. This isn't just a one and done, that I'm going to do my inventory and then go down my checklist of items on this migration. This is a part that is going to continue throughout your entire migration and hopefully beyond as you try to maintain a crypto agile environment. The second would be automation needs to be combined with manual work. You'll notice that there's this push. We want to automate everything, because who wants to sit there and do all this manually by hand? But you'll notice that the federal government has a requirement to do a manual inventory every year as well, because some of these automatic tools will not necessarily have the visibility into every aspect of your system. Your system may have some hardware that is incredibly old and has not been updated the same way, and the automatic discovery tool may not be able to actually have visibility into the crypt being used in that system. And so it's important to not focus so much on automation that you forget that sometimes manual inventorying is also still a requirement. And third, collaboration. Because if your automation doesn't have visibility into some of these tools, there are also going to be things that you receive from your vendors that you may not also know all of the crypt that's embedded in that hardware or that software. And so keeping in mind that this is not a very siloed activity. This migration is a huge collaborative effort across organizations, across industries. You need to collaborate with your vendors. Start having the conversations with your vendors now about what does their migration process look like? What are the list of crypt that is in their systems that they're selling to you? Because you need to inventory that, and you can't do it if you don't have visibility into it.
Yes, and that I think the importance of working with the ecosystem is one that's going to become more and more apparent. But let me go back to the OMB number, the 7.1 billion. And that represents, 1% of the federal IT budget each year for the next decade. And that's a useful benchmark just to help people think. But from the point of view of you're having to plan this, and what does that mean in terms of us helping to build the business case and the plan for PQC migration, in terms of we're going to need a certain amount of funding, and as Daphne said, it's not once and done, it's over a decade.
Yes, thank you. I was very lucky to be actually at the White House when NIST standards were released, and OMB actually talked about the amount. This is the first time that they actually released an amount. And just for fun, yesterday I asked ChatGPT what would be the budget that government will need to do PQC for all their system, and it came up with $5 billion, which is very interesting. But I think both numbers are underestimating the requirements, the budget that will be required to do exactly what you said, right? And one of the biggest aspects that we sort of talk in passing, it's training. We have a very small amount of people that are trained in cryptography, and moving forward, you will need more and more, and we don't have that. I mean, we need to start working on creating that workforce that it's able to take us to the next decade safely. So that's very important. So from an industry perspective, I think we have had many lessons learned on how we underestimate, and this is a technology that we cannot underestimate. We need to make sure that we move fast and we move at the pace that it's required for us to continue to be secure.
And Lamont, from the perspective of your customers who are buying networking services to connect their businesses what are critical, how do you see that budget affecting their purchasing decisions and their planning? Are they going to, at some point, need that they can buy a quantum-safe network from you and know that they then don't have to worry?
Yeah, no, and I think it's how are you going to then look at that budget to be able to help whether it's a small agency or a large agency. Take an NLRB, a National Labor Relations Board, who may not have enough budget to be able to support something like that. How are you going to take that and help them be able to get prepared to be able to ingest this type of technology and take in and get prepared for this data? Also, then how do you then take that to somebody like an HHS, which will be able, has to be able to pull all these things together and be able to build this into their systems. So it's how do you then break that up, but then how do you then take that budget and then leverage it so that it's getting the right technology and the right players in the room to be able to deliver that system, but also have that as a partnership. Because Daphne and Gary, I have to throw Gary in there. Everybody else said Gary except for me, so I want to make sure I got that. But like they're saying, there's a partnership that we're going to have to do. And how do we then leverage that and get all of us in the room to be able to say, here's the right technology, here's the right way to be able to incorporate these into your systems, and here's the right way to actually do that migration and understand what's the right path to do that based off of your risk levels and based off of not only your risk level, but how your systems and data and applications all interact with one another. Because again, like we said before multiple times throughout this is not a trivial transition to be able to go into there. You're really trying to figure out, how do we bring this technology in and not impact, how do we deliver all those other services that rely on this to a day-to-day basis and not bring them to a screeching halt? And that's only done if we figure out the right way to budget for bringing in the technology to everybody to be able to support this. Because there's one weak link, it won't really matter what we do with all of us, because then somebody will get in and find a way to be able to exploit everything, as we know.
Now, one of the things that we've seen, I've already mentioned the Bank for International Settlements, who are basically trying to figure out how to connect central banks together securely. And of course, the reason that matters, that's a $10 billion transaction. Bad people will go after those. But that's an example of a sector-specific, it's a test bed, it's a proof of concept that one firm, one industry can use. And I think I'd like to explore whether or not we think pilot projects like that or test beds are actually a valuable way of making progress. And perhaps, Michaela, I can start with you.
Sure, absolutely. We believe those are good ways to start playing, to understand what you don't understand, to learn lessons that perhaps without actually trying something in the field you would not learn. We are working both with industry, within the industry, with our customers, within the financial sector, as I mentioned, on POCs on PQC. But we are also working with universities and quantum centers that are actually now looking to develop quantum networking between the different quantum centers. And trying to understand, what we can do to further the knowledge, and also bring the academia as well into this, because it's very important to look at the future. And we are working also with different government agencies, which are actually, for instance, which are actually involved in some of these centers' work.
And again, from a large-scale network point of view, do you see the role for these test beds or trial programs?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah, because it's just everything that you said, Michaela, and we got to make sure that we're testing to understand how these things work, getting people knowledgeable on how to make these things work, and and this is a safe environment then when we're testing it before we actually do deploy them into our financial systems and deploy them into our national security systems to ensure that they're doing what they're intended to do, both for the backwards compatibility, but also for, what we're doing, native PQC, or we're doing, hybrid solutions. So it's critical for us to be able to have these test beds to test them. But back on, even to the budgeting side of this, we have to budget for those test beds, but we also have to budget for this to be operationalized too. Because one of the things which we see a lot of pilots and test beds and things that happen, and sometimes you got to remember, especially if you're putting these into national security systems, there has to be then an operational program or record which then go into, okay, how do I take this from concept to reality and make it into something that we can then deploy and it's operationally supported across the board. So that's got to be included in not only the test bed planning, but also in the budget planning too as well.
So I'm looking at the time and I'm aware that we only have a couple of minutes left. So let me ask each of you one final question, which is, what's the one thing you'd like people to take away as your recommendation for what they do next? Definitely, let me start with you.
I like giving recommendations. So the one thing that I would want people to take away from this is continue and increase your investment in standards participation. As you know, I'm from the Center for Cybersecurity Standards. Standards are going to have to be written and updated to incorporate these PQC algorithms. IETF has been working on this, putting out drafts, publishing RFCs, incorporating PQC into security protocols. 3GPP's SA3 group is going to be having discussions about this at their meeting this month and then also next month. ORAN Working Group 11, the Security Working Group, is going to be discussing PQC migration plans, and their NGRG Next Generation Research Group has already put out like a risk assessment. This is going to be happening, their discussion is going to be happening later this month. Just about every organization here in this room has representation in these standards bodies. Does your representative in this standards body know how important PQC migration is to your organization? And if not, make the effort to make sure that they have enough of the awareness and enough of the resources necessary to participate in those conversations to help us move this migration forward. Because the conversations are happening, you don't want telecoms and your company's interests to be left behind in those discussions. And then you're coming after the fact, trying to figure out how to make it fit into your systems.
Thank you. Michaela, your one takeaway that you'd like everybody to...
All that.
All that, yes.
Absolutely, the awareness piece is very important. There are many organizations like PQCC, PQC Coalition, for instance. We are part of it. I'm actually leading the education system. Please join, or it's free. Just join and get the information from all the company all the industry that is actually participating in this type of coalitions that can help with educating and includes, absolutely everybody, from IBM to MITRE to you name it, you have all the industry there that wants to help into the migration process. I would say, again, I'm doing it too much, but budgets needs to be very important. We talked about budgets. I mentioned the same thing. So I guess awareness, and budget.
Awareness and budget. I will leave the last word to Lamont. So what's the one thing you want everybody here to take away and do now?
Yeah, so I would say we have to plan, partner, and progress. So we need to plan accordingly on how we're going to move our things forward. How do we make sure this works for our systems, make sure they work for all of our applications, everything that we need to do, and move this forward. The partnering part is also, we're part of all these different standards bodies. I mean, we're part of the NIST CCOE. We're part of all the standards things that are going on. And it's not just a teleco thing. This is all of us as part of industry with our devices, our applications, our vendors, our people. How do we make sure we're all working together to partner and move this forward? And progressing, we just need to progress quickly. We need to make sure that we're working and looking at all these aspects of this and move forward as fast as we can so that we can then ensure that we're protecting the nation's assets.
Thank you very much indeed. And perhaps I can ask you to say thank you to all the panelists here.